All right, welcome to our video today. Today we're going to talk about, I'm going to introduce and talk about Bootstrap, and we do that for, I'm going to do that for a couple of reasons. Two of the primary ones anyway. That is that it's massively popular. There's a lot of developers that are using Bootstrap right now, a lot of sites that are using Bootstrap, and you'll definitely notice that once you've, especially if you're not familiar with Bootstrap, once you start working with it, and the more you work with it and see the way that Bootstrap looks, then you'll start to notice it on people's sites and that they're using Bootstrap. The other big one, and probably the one that's the most important, is that it's a responsive framework. And so I want to use this as a little bit of an easier way to start talking about mobile responsive frameworks. And so what this ties directly into is the media queries that we talked about a little bit earlier in the semester. Just like with the last lecture, what I'm going to do instead of providing any slides is we're going to use documentation provided right off of the website. And because Bootstrap does, I think, a really good job of providing their documentation and examples and everything right on their website, that is really the best place to go and learn Bootstrap. Not only now when you're first getting introduced to it, but also down the road when you're trying to, when maybe you're using Bootstrap in a project and you don't remember how to do a certain component, or you don't remember exactly the layout and how to work with it. This is the best place to go. So it'll always be there, it'll always be up to date. And as far as Bootstrap's open source, it's free, and I have heard no indications of them changing that model anytime in the future. So if you search for Bootstrap via your favorite search engine, you should be able to get results somewhat similar to this. We'll go ahead and we'll start with the getting started. Something that you need to realize is that Bootstrap has gone through several versions now, and so we're on version 3 point something, or the version 3. And so if you're starting with a project from scratch, I would encourage you to use Bootstrap 3. You may at some point in time have to support an older website, something that might be using an older version of Bootstrap, and so things are not always the same. If you're looking at a site that uses Bootstrap 2, the syntax is different in Bootstrap 3, and so you need to make sure that you can identify what version of Bootstrap you're working with if you're adopting a project or taking on a project that was previously built. You have Bootstrap provides some documentation to help with that migration. So again, just know that it's there. We'll go ahead then, when you get to the site, you'll have some of the primary components here, or the primary navigation. Getting started, there's a couple things I want to talk about here, and then we'll spend all of our time, or the rest of our time today, looking at the CSS. So getting started, we'll need to include the Bootstrap files inside of our page, and the way that we're going to do that is I'm going to link to the CDNs. And so I've uploaded again a couple of files, the starter template as well as the sample page that we'll be working with, and those are already set up there. You can download the source code, and there are some other options here that we're not going to have time to get into. So SAS and LESS, and those are some more important ways of working with Bootstrap that again, we're not just going to have time to do. So you can download the source, modify it if you need to. You can download it and include it locally in a file. But for our examples here, I'm going to link it to the CDN. For the most part then, in the files, the demo files, you'll see that they're going to be linked much like this. We'll have a couple of links to the style sheets. So maxcdn.bootstrapcdn.com, bootstrap.min.css, as well as I've also included this bootstraptheme.min.css. We'll also need the JavaScript, and so we have bootstrap.min.js. And so these are this last script, this only script, and this Bootstrap file, the CSS file, those are the two that are required, and then just like you can see in the comments here, those are optional. Other ways to install Bower and NPM and some of these that, again, they're just kind of beyond the scope of the course. So if you find yourself really getting into web development, I would encourage you to spend some time researching these, but definitely not required for the course here. With that, let's see. This talks more about how Bootstrap itself is organized, the JavaScript files and the fonts and things. And so if you really get into Bootstrap and Bootstrap development, you'll want to come back here and read through some of this. We don't need to worry about compiling CSS and JavaScript because we're not going to be doing that. So that's really the only thing that we need to talk about on this page, even though there's quite a bit more content here. I guess there is one other thing. If we go down to the basic template, I have uploaded this. So the Bootstrap 101 template is uploaded, and you can see that there really isn't much Bootstrap to it other than including the Bootstrap files, including jQuery here, as well as in our head section, linking to the Bootstrap style sheet. You'll notice with the starter template, though, this doesn't link to a CDN for the Bootstrap file. So this template here assumes that you have them downloaded and they're available within the website that you're building. Some other tags that we'll talk about here shortly, and so we'll get to that when we get to the code. Outside of that, there are a ton of sample starter templates that you can take a look at. And so starter templates, Bootstrap themes, grids, pretty much every way that you can work with Bootstrap, there is a sample website with all of the code that you can go and look at and study. And so if you wanted to, let's say, try to recreate this site right here, you can click on that link. This is the site itself. In order to understand how any of this stuff is done using Bootstrap, you can right-click, inspect element. You can see that content, those elements there. You can right-click and view the page source as well. And so here's the layout in order to get that template file, that web page using Bootstrap. Right, so a lot of great resources out there. Again, but a little bit more geared towards if you start to do more advanced or I guess do more Bootstrap for a living. Oops. We'll go back to the page then. All right, so outside of getting started, one of the first things that you need to understand when working with Bootstrap is really the CSS and the grid system and how things are laid out. And so this component, this section of the website, CSS, is really important to understand, at least the first little bit of it. Again, there's quite a few topics in here, and we don't need to get into all of them at this point in time. Bootstrap is HTML5, and so with our doc type, the doc statement here, you'll see that it defines it as HTML5. We also define the language to be English, and so you'll see that in the template. Mobile first, and this is maybe a shift for some people to think about, especially in terms of development, in that Bootstrap is built with a mobile device in mind first. And so the CSS, the way that it approaches all of the layout, it's developing for the mobile device, the smartphone, or something that's along the scale of the size of a smartphone, and then it adapts from there. It provides media queries that will adapt your responsive layout to a tablet and to desktops and things even larger. And so Bootstrap focuses on the mobile device first. With that in mind, there are a couple of meta tags. And again, we're not going to get too in the weeds on these at this point in time. You're going to see these inside of the head section. And so you're going to need to, in order to work with Bootstrap, you're going to need to have these tags there. So again, you'll see that in the template, and you'll see that in the demo code that we'll talk about today. If we get a chance, I'll come back and talk more about these later. If not, and again, you get into more development, web development, especially mobile development, down the road, you'll want to come back and spend a little time studying these meta tag, viewport, meta tag with their content. Typography and links and normalizing, again, important concepts that what Bootstrap does is it defines certain ways in which any site that uses Bootstrap looks, and so using font families and font bases and some other things, again, that we're not going to have time to talk about right now. As far as the layout then, the first decision that we have to make and understand in order to create a site that uses Bootstrap is the container. Our container element then is a class. It's a class that we include in the Bootstrap style sheet, and we have two options. We can start with a class container, which gives us a fixed width, or we can use class container fluid, which gives us fills whatever that container is, fills the entire element that it belongs to. We'll look at two examples of that here in the sample code. And so we have to start with a container, though. Whether it's container or container fluid, we have to start with a container. Keep in mind that you can use containers in multiple places inside of a website. It's not just one container. Anytime you want to define a Bootstrap row that has Bootstrap columns, you need to put them inside of a container. That's the important part. So once you've defined that container, then Bootstrap is broken into essentially a grid system. You have rows and you have columns. You can think of it like a table. You can almost think of it like a spreadsheet. And so inside of a container then, we define the rows and then we define the columns. How we define those, or how Bootstrap defines those, is through its media queries. So how does it know when to wrap content so that it fits on a screen? Right? We have a mobile first strategy here, and what that is trying to do is essentially trying to prevent any of our websites, any of the users that are coming to those websites from having to scroll horizontally. Everything should stack vertically, and only when that page has more space will the content start to come and line up side by side in more of a horizontal fashion. Bootstrap defines those breakpoints then, when there's enough width to allow that content to stack side by side, if it's desired anyway, through its media queries. And you can see through those media queries, you can look at the Bootstrap CSS if you want and actually look at the media queries. But how it defines those is by these points, these breakpoints right here. So we have 4 primary classes that we work with when we start working with Bootstrap. ExtraSmall, Small, Medium, and Large. And we'll go through all 4 of these when we look at the sample code today. These are the breakpoints. So anything that's less than 768 pixels is considered a phone. Anything that's greater than or equal to 768 is a tablet. Anything that's greater than 992 pixels is a desktop. And anything that is medium desktop, laptop, and then anything that's greater than or equal to 1200 pixels is considered a desktop, like a monitor on your desk. Right, so these are the breakpoints. These are the widths that the media queries are looking for in order to determine what type of device the website is on. Right, with this grid then, we have rows and we have columns. Each row can have up to 12 columns. And so based off of these breakpoints then, what we have to determine is simply how many columns we want per row. When we're on a mobile device, typically we want the columns to stack vertically. When we're on a desktop, we have more space, more width, so we can have the columns stacked next to each other horizontally if we need to. So we apply these classes. We determine the column layout based off of these class prefixes. -col, -xs, dash, and then the number. That number then is an integer value that represents between 1 and 12. That says that this is, on an extra small device, this is going to be 1 column, or it's going to take up 3 columns, or 5, or whatever the case may be. And so, as the page is being rendered on different devices, then we can change how many columns any particular element consumes or occupies based off of these classes. Right? And here is the example, and I actually have converted this example into a standalone file, and we'll go through that. And I think that will really help solidify or make concrete what we're talking about here. So the rest of this page and the rest of our video is just going through, looking at the container, the row, and then how do we work with these columns in order to get that responsive layout. Okay, so we'll go through all of this example here, which is a good chunk of this particular document. This is the basis of it. This is as far as I want to get with our introduction. I just want you to be able to understand how the columns and how the rows are used, how the container, the columns, and the rows are used. So if you understand that by the time we're done and by looking at the code, then you're in a great spot. So I've uploaded to our class folder 2 files, the Bootstrap Template and then the Bootstrap Demo. Inside of the template then, as I mentioned, and it's identical to the one that was provided by Bootstrap because it is the same one, this is kind of like a boilerplate then, a starting point. So anytime that you want to create a site that uses Bootstrap, this is a good place to start. You'll see in the head section, you have to have and define these 3 meta tags, right? The char set, the HTTP equiv, and this viewport one, right? So you need to have those. From there, we can define things like the title, what shows up in the tab of the URL bar, or not the URL bar, but the tab or the window. We have our link to our Bootstrap. We have this other section here that provides shim and browser compatibility support. Again, I hate to load this video up with a bunch of things that we're not really going to have time to talk about, but this is another one of those. I could have deleted it, and I thought about removing it from this template, from our template, but I did want to leave it in there because, again, if you start doing this more web development down the road, it is important to understand shims and how they work. They help with browser compatibility. The last thing that you want is your client, your customer to come to your site. You use Bootstrap, but because their browser is older or it's not supporting what you're doing, it's not supportive of Bootstrap, it breaks the site. And so you can include things like this in order to help ensure compatibility with all browsers. So I left it in here to go ahead and if we don't get a chance, I don't think we'll get a chance to talk about it, you can do a little bit of research there. From there, we have our body. Inside of the body, just some arbitrary content, hello Bootstrap, and then our script tags, right? So for this particular template, the script links for jQuery to a CDN, and the script for Bootstrap linking to the CDN. This order is important because Bootstrap is dependent on jQuery. We need to load jQuery first, and then we load Bootstrap. So there is a reason that this is loaded first before this. Okay. As far as the sample file goes, then it looks a little bit large, but there isn't really a lot in here. If you open that file, and this one you're safe to just run off your desktop, you should see a page that looks similar or identical, I guess I should say, to this. I'm going to open up, so if you open up your developer tools and you have a responsive design mode, which Firefox has, I'm going to go ahead and be in that responsive design mode, because that's going to allow me to quickly go through and kind of test that the responsive layout of my site without having to readjust my browser. So that's the mode that I'm in right now. As far as the site, you'll see a lot of the stuff, the boilerplate, the template that we looked at just previously. There's the meta tags, there's the links to Bootstrap bin.css and Bootstrap theme.css. Here's jQuery, here's Bootstrap. So a lot of this stuff here is just boilerplate stuff. You already know what it is, so you don't have to spend any time wondering what it is. We have a style section, and I did need to define these styles in order to get the layout that we're going to see. So you can take some time and look at those styles and see how they're applying to the actual document. I won't, just because I want to focus on looking at the actual Bootstrap itself. From here, then, we have our HTML. This is how we're using the Bootstrap classes in order to get this responsive design. So we'll start. I'm going to just create a little bit of space here to start off with, and we'll take a look at this first example. So this first one here, and I'm going to make a slight modification. I'm going to close that element, and I'm going to open up a new one so that they're in separate containers. There we go. And so we'll look at this first one. So this first is a container class, right? Like I said, we have to have a container, then we define a row, and then we can define our elements that have different columns. Okay, so if we have these two elements in here, and let's say that I don't have any classes defined at all, then what will happen by default is, because Bootstrap is mobile first, then when we load this page, or in this case when I refresh this page, you can see that content is stacked. Right? That's what we'd want it to do on a mobile device, because if we're on a smartphone and we have a limited width, we'd want the content to be on top of each other. We don't want it to scroll off to the side horizontal, causing the user to have to scroll left and right. We want it to be stacked. So that's the default for all of our Bootstrap columns, right? And you can really see that pretty much with everything here except these two, and we'll figure out why that's doing that here in a moment, right? But as I get bigger, as the page gets bigger, as we have more width available, these two elements stay stacked, because that is the default. Only when we apply these additional classes do we break from that standard. And so if we add those classes back in, then what I can say is, let's say column medium 6 and column medium 6. What this is telling Bootstrap to do then is we're essentially triggering a media query. We're saying that when the breakpoint is large enough, when we're on a medium, right, and if we don't remember what medium is, we just go to the Bootstrap table here, or the website here, scroll back up to this grid and say, all right, medium is any device that has a width greater than or equal to 992 pixels. So when we're on a device, when there is 992 pixels or more in that viewport, then these will be 6 columns and 6 columns. So in a row of 12, each one of those elements will take up half. So we go back to our page, and I can refresh that, and you can see there it went. Right? So below that breakpoint, it stacks nicely. Above that breakpoint, and now it's 6 and 6. Right? Right? And then we can have this kind of cascade. So let's say that we want this to be above a medium at 6, but if it's really large, let's say that we want this first one to column large. Yep. let's say that on large, I want this first one to actually occupy 9 of the 12, and then on this one, I want it to occupy only 3. Because we can only have, with these, since these are columns in this row can only have 12 columns. So if this one occupies 9, then this one can only be 3, because 9 and 3 is 12. Right? So now this will change based off of those breakpoints. Right? We have it stacked. Once we hit the medium, it goes 6 and 6. Once we hit large, it goes 9 and 3. Right? So you can see how nice and smooth it is. It's responsive based off of the dimension of the device, the width of the device that's viewing it. Okay, container, that's our container class. So we have a fixed width. If I say container fluid, then the only thing that changes here is that instead of having this content, you can see that there is a fixed width. No matter how wide I get this, this content is only going to be so wide. If I make it fluid, you can see then it's fluid. It fills the entire width of whatever its parent is. And because this HTML is within the body, right? This is right here. This is the whole browser window. Other than that, though, the rows and the behaviors is identical, right? The breakpoints hit and the content responds appropriately as we defined with that layout. All right, and now we can define multiple containers. So we have container fluid, maybe that's a header. We have another container that's a fixed width. So we have different components, different areas. You can put containers and rows and columns anywhere that you want in your website. But we're focusing right now on really kind of that big picture layout. Okay, so here's another example. The difference with this one is that I'm using this ExtraSmall class. And so if we go back to our documentation and look at ExtraSmall, this is this class right here. For ExtraSmall devices, anything less than 768, then it will allow us to use the grid system, right? Because the default, if we look at the default here, when we get below that small breakpoint, everything stacks. But these two don't. These two have columns, and sometimes on small devices we don't want everything to stack. Sometimes we want to have columns on the same row. And so this allows us to do that. This allows us to say that below that 768, I do want this element and this element each to occupy half of the row. Okay, and because we define that at that point, it stays that way all the way up. Right? We said below at that lowest breakpoint it's half and half, and so unless we change that by adding a different class, it's going to be half and half. So again, maybe at column small, we want it to be 4 and 8, and then maybe at medium, we say it's going to be column 2 and column 10. Right, there we go. And we can see that content change as we hit those different breakpoints. All right, the last bit then here is just, again, it's really just a reiteration then of what we've been talking about, in that we have another row, right? We can have multiple rows inside of a container. We're just trying to essentially build a grid. And what these rows are doing, I put column medium 1, right? So because these are 1, we have 12 columns, 12 elements that have this class defined on it. Below that medium breakpoint, they stack. Above that, then each one occupies one column in that 12 column row. So if we go back and look at this example like you've been seeing here, we're below medium, so there's the row, there's our 12 columns stacked vertically. Once we're above the medium breakpoint, they go horizontal. Each column then is taking up, or each element, each div is 1 column's width. Right? So we can see all of those laid out there. The rest of the code sample then is just simply going through, much like we've already done, just going through different combinations. We have another row, 8 and 4 is 12. We have another row, 4 and 4 and 4 is 12. We have another row, 6 and 6 is 12. And so we can use that then to create the layouts that we want. this is very simple. And so, you know, oftentimes I'll do something like this when I first start working with a website, when I'm first trying to figure out how I want my layout to be. You know, I'll have my rows, and I'll have the columns, and I'll have, you know, I'll apply some temporary styles to get this type of a layout, so that if I want to, let's say I want to make this a big header, and I want to make this maybe be my navigation, and this to be content, and this as a sidebar, and here's the footer. Now I'll do something like this until I get the basic, very basic structure of the site, and then I'll come back and I'll start filling in more of the finer details. What does the header actually look like? What is the content in the footer? What goes in the sidebar? Things like that. Okay, so that is, again, a very brief, relatively brief introduction to Bootstrap, but the importance right now is just understanding how to do this. If I said create a page that had a container and a row, and that above the median breakpoint it had the columns became 4, you know, 3 elements consume 4 columns, you know, that's what you want to be able to do. Depending on the breakpoint, being able to identify how to style these, or excuse me, how to lay those out, and then when they change, right? Understanding, just like with these early examples, that it's half and half on small, but then as we hit a median breakpoint, I have a class that changes what each element, the number of columns that it consumes, and then as we hit a larger breakpoint, it changes again. So being able to understand how all this is working. All right, so play around with the code. Get in here, change some of these classes, try to create some of your own layouts, modifying these and just seeing how it works. As usual, if you have any questions or run into any issues, let me know, and I can help you to figure those out. Otherwise, that's really our introduction to Bootstrap, and we'll start talking a little bit more about PHP and in our next in our future content, and also including Bootstrap then into some of the stuff that we're doing at the end to include the final project. So. All right, that's all I got. I'll talk to you guys in the next video.